So today I would like to tell you a story, a strange story, which has to do with the mysterious palace which exists outside the walls of the city of Florence. It's mysterious, nobody knows, and maybe I do, I'll tell you what, why it is there and why it is called the Palace of the Devils. Not the Devil's Palace, the Palace of several, many devils, plural. And also it's a story which has to do with ancient history, Renaissance painting, a Florentine painter named Agnolo Allori, known as the Bronzino. I'll tell you about these things, and a story with many elements which may click together and make sense. And the point that I would like to make is that the reason why this idea came to my mind is because of a science fiction novel that I read long ago by Arthur C. Clarke. You know the name probably because he was the author of the story behind A Space Odyssey. He was a famous science fiction writer. He was not just a writer, he was a scientist, so he had many interesting ideas, and one was that he did um, prefigure Google Maps. The story is that there is one of the story, this story, the City and the Stars, that goes back to the 1950s, and it is the story of a city named Diaspar, which exists on the only city on a desolate planet, existing there for maybe a million years, and the inhabitants have lost their history. They don't know why the city is there, what's happened in the past. Apparently, there have been battles, some conflicts, and things, but they don't know exactly what happened. So they search for their own ancient story, and eventually they find a sort of library, a place where they find a virtual map of the city. Something like Google Maps, indeed, three-dimensional, that they can examine the city from above, but also they can turn a knob and see the evolution, go backward in time, seeing the evolution of the city. And then eventually they discover what happened. And it's a long story. It's a beautiful novel, fantastic. But the interesting thing that exactly prefigures Google Maps, and Google Maps is a fantastic toy. We can play a lot with it. I'm sure you do play with Google Maps just like I do. And I would like to show you something today, and this you recognize it is a piece, a part of Italy, the peninsula we call Italy, and we can zoom so easily and zoom down, and we find this city, which is the city where I'm now, right now, in this moment, I'm here in Florence, and we cannot zoom backward in time. But if we look carefully at the structure of the city, what we see, then we can understand a lot of how the, the fabric, the organization of the city got together and was built over the years. So we can see, for instance, you see this big triangle here, sort of triangle. These are the ancient medieval walls, now by now mainly demolished, and they enclose the city up to mid 19th century. As you know, if you zoom in, you can find another element very clear here. You see this rectangle. This rectangle is the medieval city, even the Roman city. The city was built, created in Roman times, and the Romans had built their city in orienting the streets along the north, south, east, west, which was typical of the Romans, and these structures remained as it was still today. See, many of these buildings here are modern, relatively modern, let's say 19th century, but still this map of the city is still the Roman one. And if you look at some areas outside, slightly outside, because Florence was built on the banks of the river Arno was absolutely important for Florence. Was the main element of the economy for transportation, for the use of water, for all those things. And here you see still the medieval city, parts of the medieval city. This kind of architecture is very dense, as you can see. You see the roofs in in many shapes and orientation. In those times, they built the houses as leaning on each other, compenetrating each other. They did that probably because their resources were limited. They had to save on transportation, on heating, internal heating. So you had all the houses very close together, and this is very, very typical. You see, you can see also in 3D, and you can see many of these houses have towers or remnants of towers. Probably there were some towers around, but over the years they have disappeared. But we can still recognize the medieval implant, the medieval traces. Now let's zoom out again. You see the Arno River, and this is the southern part of the city, which we Florentines we call it Oltrarno, the other side of the Arno, because this is the real city in a certain sense, the noble part of the city. Once the poor lived here on the southern part of the city. My family, incidentally, originates from this side of the city. We were poor. My ancestors were poor, and you can still see the part of the medieval walls are still existing. You can see this kind of, this is the southern pole or the southern door of the city, and the walls are still there. But outside the walls, the architecture is relatively modern, 19th century. There was nothing here until 1860, more or less. Then they started building here, and they built a lot. And this is an area that today is rather fancy, I would say, but an interesting story is that you see there's an expansion here, a very large expansion, which this big rectangle here is 1950, 1960s. It's a modern development where they housed a large population which was growing after the war, and so they had to build these houses here, and they did. Now, there comes the mystery. Let me tell you the story. You zoom on this area, this is all modern, all rather ugly architecture, not specially, nothing really special here that you would say. But if you look carefully, something strange. I don't know if you can see this. We zoom into it, and there you are. What is this? Different color, different shape. What is this? It looks very much like one of those medieval buildings that I was showing to you 1 minute ago. Medieval building here. What is it doing here? And but it is medieval by all means. You see, this is a construction. So many details here that are not modern. No way that they are modern. Look, you can use the little guy or Google Maps to take a look at this building, and it is medieval. This is not modern with these clear medieval elements. And if you look at it from above, probably there was a tower here. This looks like a tower that was cut, because towers were medieval towers were a little dangerous as buildings, so it had to be cut. But then the question is what it is. What is it doing here? And indeed, what is its name? And you find it, the sources you can find. Yeah, there is this strange building which gave the name to the whole area. It is called the Palace of the Devils. This is what I was telling you at the beginning, the Palace of the Devils. Devils? Well, it doesn't seem that anyone ever made a study of this palace. Okay, why? What's happening here? How it's done? What purpose did it have? I only say, well, Well, there is this story. Maybe the superstitious peasants around, they thought they were, God knows what. They had some strange things happening in this palace at night, and said the palace of the devils. Okay, nothing more. You cannot find anything more on Wikipedia on this stories of Florence. This area, really, nobody's very much interested in. This is the only um, element that you as a tourist you might be interested in. The rest is all modern, so nobody cares about this area. But if you are curious, then you may ask yourself a few questions. So why? And clearly, this area is flat. I didn't find maps of this area, real ancient maps of this area, because nobody really cared about. This was a dump site for the city. They dumped all the waste they have in this area because it was a plain, an alluvial plain, probably every once in a while flooded by the river. And so it is strange. Why would you build a palace in a place commonly flooded? And why doesn't he have a name? Because there are plenty of medieval palaces in Florence. They all have a name. Palace Gondi, Palace Guicciardini, Palace Bardi. Very ancient times. My family, Ugo Bardi, they were rich, and they had a palace which still exists. It's called Palace Bardi. Unfortunately, I did not inherit it, but that's another story. I wish I had. But it's no name. No rich Florentine family is associated with this palace. The only other thing we know is this story that the famous painter Agnolo di Cosimo, nicknamed Bronzino, was born here or lived there. Not clear. Anyway, was associated with this palace. So how is this story? Okay, I have an explanation and I will tell it to you. You think about that for a moment. Maybe you come up with the same explanation, but let me tell it to you. And then you think about that and you decide if it makes sense. And the story is that it made a lot of sense to build a palace right there because the river was close and the river was a fundamental commercial connection line from Florence to the rest of the Mediterranean area, the rest of Europe too. A sort of merchandise would come from the ports of Pisa and be brought to Florence by barge. And I'm sure that a lot of merchandise will come from the Middle East, from Northern Africa, regions where the infidels lived. But they would bring in stuff that the Florentines loved, like silk, like spices, even gold, because Florentine coined money, and there are no gold mines around, so they had to import gold, very likely from the Middle East, from the Near East, or this kind of area. So it means that some Eastern or North African merchants would come all the way to Florence, but it is likely, I think, that at that time the Florentines didn't like to have these infidels in town. So let's find a compromise. We don't want you in town, but we want to trade with you. So we build for you a palace outside of the city, near the river. You arrive with your ship, your boat, your barge. You moor the barge here, then you take your merchandise in this palace. And we come from Florence and we trade, and everybody's happy. And it makes a lot of sense because otherwise I would not see any reason to build a palace in the middle of nothing. There are plenty of things now, plenty of buildings, but then there was nothing. It was an alluvial plain, useless maybe for some agriculture, but not more than that. Not a detail. See, this is a hill here, and this is the city. So building this palace here, it was not only far away, but could not even be seen. So they wanted to make sure the Florentines, you stay there. We don't even see you. If we want to see you, we come to discuss with you. And so the devils were the Muslims, the Middle Eastern people, devils. It was a common way of defining foreigners. Maybe the Middle Easterners would say that of Florentines, they are the devils. It's a way of seeing each other. Does it make sense? I think so, because this is not the only palace of devils in Italy. There are probably many, but I could find only another one, and I will show it to you. There it goes. This is the another Palazzo dei Diavoli, which is in Siena, which is a town about 60 kilometers south of Florence. And why do I say that it is an oriental palace? Because of the round tower. A round tower like this, it's absolutely exceptional. In the medieval Tuscan architecture, you never find round towers. Only Eastern architecture has this kind of tower. So it makes a lot of sense that this palace was built as a sort of foreign object. Maybe the Turkish, say, merchants, they built it with their own money, so they say, well, we want a round tower, and that's what we will have. Or maybe it was built with a round tower to emphasize the alienness. See, when you stay there, you see the walls of the city are there, and at night they closed the doors. You devils stay outside. We people of Siena stay inside. We trade, but we don't want to have too much to do with each other. And even here, Siena didn't have the same kind of river like Florence had. So this is, but I'm sure that they imported a lot of goods from Florence. So indeed, the Palace of the Devils is north of Siena. Okay, we must settle it. Palace of the Devils goes north, and very likely, I think they would import goods from Florence, and so but they still wanted to make sure that the devils, maybe they included also the Florentines. So there is a very ancient rivalry between Florentines and Sienese. They don't like each other still today, but that's another story. So you see, probably there are more palaces like this in Italy. I could find these two, but another little point. How about Bronzino? We said that practically the only thing we know about the Palace of the Devils of Florence is that a famous painter, Agnolo di Cosimo, known as Bronzino, was born here. That makes a lot of sense. Because what does it mean, Bronzino? Bronzino comes from the term bronze. Bronze means brown colored. Bronzino's skin was of the color of bronze. It was not really black, probably just dark skin. Which, I mean, Florentines are not Aryans. The skin is not very white, but evidently Bronzino's skin was especially dark, so he had this nickname. And again, it makes a lot of sense, because if this is a place where Oriental people from Africa or from Middle East lived, then it is likely that some of them at least, were black or dark skinned, so they had not just trading goods, but very likely they were trading also in other kinds of, of exchanges, out of which there was born a boy by this Mr. Agnolo, Mr. Cosimo, Mr. Cosimo. Agnolo di Cosimo means, Agnolo is Bronzino, Cosimo is father. So his father was named Cosimo. He probably was Florentine. His mother may have been a black or dark-skinned girl from the east. Maybe, we don't know. We probably never know, but it makes a lot of sense, as I said, because here was a place where dark-skinned people lived, and devils again, because at that time that was the way things were seen. So, again, a lot of sense. And just a final note, who was Bronzino exactly? What did he think? What did he do in Florence, being a little dark? And also, he was also homosexual. He tells that to us. He left us a few poems in which it is clear. It's not so clear, I mean, not explicit, because in the 16th century, being homosexual was not so easy. It was a different story. In the 16th century, it was still a crime to be homosexual, and I am sure that for Bronzino it must have been a difficult time to be both dark-skinned and homosexual in a society which didn't see these two characteristics as positive. And let me show you something else just out of curiosity, because the Bronzino didn't leave us a self-portrait. We don't know what he looked like. He was a mannerist, a very fancy and technically able painter. You see, this is probably his most famous painting. It's called the Allegory of Venus and Cupid. See, all perfect. Everything is perfect. Every detail is in place. It's a lot of meaning in this, but it's a long story. But I think in this painting we have the one and the only self-portrait of Bronzino. Self-portrait of Bronzino, which is this face here. Why do I say that? It's a long story. It is not so easy to tell. It is an interpretation of mine. You don't have to believe it. But I think, and it appears clear for what Bronzino writes, that he was a tormented man. His search for perfection in so many details was because he didn't see himself as perfect. He saw himself as damned, maybe even a criminal, because it was sodomy at the time was a crime, and yet he saw himself also as an angel, and a female angel of some kind. Not sure, not as a devil. He was coming from the palace of devils, but he saw himself as an angel. So he painted himself with his angelic face, however, stuck in a body that you see here is a body of a monster. So Bronzino had this double personality, the way he saw himself, an angel on one side, a monster on the other, and that's the way he painted himself, at least the way I interpret this painting, which might be wrong, but I have a feeling that interpretation tell us a lot of things, and Bronzino, after all, was a Florentine like me, and we have some bond in having lived in the same city of Italy. This now a big city, which is still built at the middle of Italy, with so many things, so many difficult things, so many people, and yet the place where my ancestors have been living for many centuries, and we still have a certain degree of kinship between us and they, and we feel this kinship, and we try to understand what they were thinking, they were doing, they were imagining, they were painting maybe, and so I told you this story. I hope you found it interesting, and thank you for having listened if you arrived all the way to here.